Everybody ready? There's an Air Force uniform that hangs in my closet. It's not mine. It belongs to my dad. You see, my dad served on a B-24 bomber during World War II. On one collar is his silver lieutenant bar that designates his rank. On the other collar, it has his wings, along with a little tiny propeller in the circle. On the arm, there's a big blue patch that signifies that he was part of the mighty 8th Air Force. The 8th Air Force is the one that did most of the bombing deep into Germany late in World War II. Next slide. Dad was in college at the University of Wisconsin when Uncle Sam called him up to war. He was only a few months away from graduating. He had hoped to graduate before he would have to go to war. But Uncle Sam said, no, I need you now. So he joined the Air Force, and he wanted to be on a bomber. And he was on a B-24, also known as the Liberator. And to be on a bombing crew, you had to know a lot of different skills. So they had to train him and his crewmates in a lot of different areas. For example, anybody on a bomber had to know how to use the machine guns so that if they lost a machine gun operator, someone else could jump in, take that gun, and operate it. He also had to go to school to learn to be a bombardier and another training school to learn how to be a navigator. So these schools were in different places. So at one point he was in Louisiana, then he was in Texas, and then of all places, he was in Mountain Home, Idaho. My dad was excited about going to Mountain Home, Idaho because of the name. He thought, oh, there are beautiful mountains there. Well, he was a little disappointed when he got to Mountain Home, let's just say that. But once he was there, my mom came out from Wisconsin. She took a train out from Wisconsin to Idaho. And Mom and Dad were married in Boise at St. John's Cathedral on Hay Street in the North End. The reason I tell you where they were married is that many years later, I was the director of live TV news on the California coast. And I was offered a job by KTVB Channel 7 to come to Boise and do the same thing. I moved here. Shortly thereafter, I found my wife-to-be, and she was living just a few doors down from St. John's Cathedral. And I thought, life has a pretty good sense of humor sometimes. But now let's go back to 1944. This is a picture of the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine bomber that could hold thousands of pounds worth of bombs and could go thousands of miles to get deep into Germany. Serving on a bomber like this was no easy task at all. On any given mission, they might lose 1 or 2 crewmates to death or dismemberment or some sort of wound or injury. That was hard on Dad, because these guys had been in these training camps together, and they had grown to be almost like brothers to one another. They were very close. On one mission, the pilot was killed, Leo. And that really hurt my dad, because Leo was my dad's best friend among the crew. And he also happened to have been Dad's best man at his wedding in Boise. It was hard because you also had to serve 30 missions before the Air Force would discharge you and send you back to America. Well, not many guys could get to 30 missions before they were killed. So that was discouraging. Imagine how the morale would be if you knew that the odds were pretty low of you surviving this stint in the Air Force. Next slide. So by his 20th mission, almost the entire crew had been killed or injured or handicapped. And so Dad became what was known as a floater. He was a guy who was available to plug into other crews who might need a navigator or a bombardier. So on his 20th mission, all of a sudden he's flying with all these guys that he doesn't know at all. He goes from flying with people that he feels are almost like his own brothers to a bunch of people that he doesn't know at all. And their target for that day was Hamburg, Germany. Well, Hamburg is the largest port city in Germany. And so that's where the Nazis launched most of their battleships, cruisers, destroyers, a lot of their submarines, etc. So as you can imagine, it was heavily fortified against enemy bombings. And there had been a lot of enemy bombings. So they had a lot of practice trying to shoot down these bombers. It became famous among the Allies for structures such as this one, that were these huge castle-like structures that were a number of stories high, and at each of the four corners of the castle-like building, there were huge flak guns. And those flak guns could shoot 4 miles into the sky. 4 miles. And they would shoot these exploding steel shells that would disintegrate into spinning shards of steel, and those things would go through aluminum bombers like a can opener through a can of tuna fish. What it did to flesh, blood, and bone was horrific. Allied flyers hated having to go to Hamburg. During their mission over Hamburg, they were hit by flak. The plane was heavily damaged. They knew they were in trouble. So they were all on the intercom with the pilot talking about what their options were, what they could do. And it was pretty quickly agreed upon that there was no way they were going to make it all the way back to England, to their home base. So they tried to come up with other options. They didn't want to be Nazi prisoners of war. They knew enough about how the Nazis were treating their prisoners of war to know that that wasn't going to be a good ending. So what they decided to do is fly the relatively short hop across to southern Sweden. Sweden was a neutral country in World War II. And there were rules, as it were, for maintaining neutrality in a war. So what the Swedes had to do is any member of an armed force, whether it was Nazis or British or American or whatever, once they came into Sweden, they had to be kept there until the end of the war. So when they found a landing strip, and it wasn't a nice long landing strip like they had hoped, they crash landed. When they crash landed, the co-pilot broke his back, and the next day he died. The rest of the guys were okay. When they got out of the plane, there were Swedish authorities that met them with their guns drawn, but for Dad and his crewmates, their war was over. So for the rest of the war, they were to spend time as prisoners of war, if you will. However, being a prisoner of war in Sweden wasn't anything like being a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany. In fact, they were lodged in an old hotel building, and they were allowed to go into town and watch movies on the weekends. My dad learned to cross-country ski while he was there. So this wasn't exactly like being a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany at all. So for Dad, his war was over. But my mom didn't know that he was safe. And my mom was back home worrying. I often think, which job would have been tougher? Going up there and risking your life every day and seeing your buddies having their arms shot off and bleeding to death, or being home, worrying about somebody, and not knowing whether they were okay or not. Well, at that point, the Swedes allowed each of the flyers to send a telegram home. And my dad's was just 3 words: "I'm alive, Carl." I'm sure that was a great and joyful moment for my mom to know that Dad was alive. But I'm sure she would have liked to have known a lot more. And then they allowed the flyers to send home pictures of themselves. Well, my dad was wearing a sweater that he had bought in Sweden because, it's pretty far to the north. They have pretty cold winters. So he had bought a sweater. Well, the sweater had all these caribou, or reindeer if you will, on them. And the military censors of Sweden had to make sure that none of the notes or letters going back home contained any information about where the flyers were, because that could be given back to the U.S. Air Force, and then they could figure out, oh, those guys are in Sweden, and they could try to rescue them or whatever. So that kind of intelligence wasn't allowed to get out. So the military censors looked at that sweater and they said, we can't allow this to go back home because we're the only neutral country in World War II that has reindeer in it. And there are reindeer all over this guy's sweater. That's like flashing a signal saying, hey, I'm in Sweden. So they took out their scissors and they cut out his sweater. And my mom got a picture that essentially had Dad's floating head in it. And was missing his entire body. And I'm thinking, wow, I can imagine her reaction. Is he missing an arm? Is he in a full body cast? Is he paraplegic? I mean, you just don't know. It's nice to see his head, but that's all that she could see. Luckily, at that point, the war was almost over. And it was only about 6 months later that Hitler committed suicide and the Nazis surrendered. My mom and Dad had a happy reunion. I'm sure that was a very joyful moment. Next slide. Having Dad's uniform is a little memento for me. And it allows me to think back about all the memories I have with my dad. You see, Dad died over 10 years ago. That may sound like a long time. I still think about him just about every day. And think about what a good dad he was. And how much he cared for myself and my 4 brothers. And my mom. And it gives me hope. It gives me courage. Because I think if he, at the age of 22, could go through this experience of having the Nazis shoot at him and seeing his crewmates killed and wounded right in front of him, and come out of that as a fairly sane person who was kind to his family and his friends, then what have I got to complain about with the problems that I go through in life? Surely I can overcome those problems if he could go through that and come out as well as he did. Now, Dad didn't talk much about World War II, and that was very common with his generation. Tom Brokaw always called them the greatest generation. And I think really that was a conscious decision on their part, that they were traumatized by it, that they didn't want to add to anyone else's burden by talking about it. So they kept it inside. But one year, Dad took my 4 brothers and I to a movie about World War II. And it had like all sorts of Hollywood stars in it. And it had a big build-up and lots of advertising. And so we were excited about seeing it. Before we walked in the theater, my dad stopped and he talked to us. And it was the first time I remember him talking about World War II to us. So I was listening closely. And he said, I just want you boys to know that I'm not taking you guys to this movie to try to glorify war. I'm trying to take you to it so that you can look deeper in it and see how horrific and how awful war is, because it really is an awful thing. And he said, we've been through 2 world wars, and they've been horrible. And I hope and pray that your generation doesn't have to go through a 3rd world war. And then we saw the movie. But those words are still with me today. Mom and Dad raised my 4 brothers and I. We had pretty happy lives. We've got great memories of both of them. And I'm really glad that I had my mom and my dad for my parents. They were wonderful people. Next slide. So when I look at that uniform, hanging in my closet, I'm looking at not only a memento of my dad's, but I'm looking at something that reminds me that he was my hero, that he truly did an amazing thing at just 22 years of age and came through it okay. And that inspires me. As I said, it gives me hope, it gives me courage, and it makes me think I don't have much to complain about with the problems that I have compared to what Dad had to go through. And he remains to this day my hero and my brother's hero. He was a great dad. I miss him greatly, but I still have a lot of great memories of him. And I hope you've enjoyed this story about my dad's experiences. And I thank you for